Thank you everyone for joining us today. Welcome to a very special webinar mini-series from the home office brought to you by the Centro Institute. My name is Ryan Manchi. I lead the Centro Institute and I am your host for today. Quick little bit about Centro before we jump into the webinar. Centro is a provider of software and services for digital advertisers. Our technology is designed to boost media team and business performance that enables advertisers to plan, buy, analyze campaigns all on a centralized and collaborative system that we call Basis. We have an amazing team of more than 750 media specialists, data pros, programmatic prodigies, operations wizards, account leaders, and digital experts across 44 offices, North America, Canada, Mexico, the United States, and all the way over across the pond in London, England. We provide our clients with raving fan service at every stage of any campaign, and a recording of this webinar and the slides will be shared with you, and we'll have time for questions at the end. We're so happy that you joined us today. Let's get into it. So we are in the midst of a 5-part webinar mini-series examining industries in flux, where so many industries are dealing with challenges today, unprecedented, unforeseen challenges, but many of these industries are also seeing massive opportunity. So over the course of the next 30 minutes, you will hear some very solid insights and recommendations based upon the latest industry trends, consumer behaviors, and we'll also maybe share some success stories and recommendations that we're seeing in the market. Today, we're talking consumer packaged goods, so grab that disinfected cart and let's hit the aisles. We are joined by 2 excellent experts. First up is April Weeks, who is EVP of Media Strategy and Operations at Centro. April brings over 2 decades of digital media expertise, and she has partnered with clients across nearly every vertical, including CPG, and she leads those teams of those media specialists, data pros, operations wizards that I mentioned before. Also this week, we are joined by Jared Rosenblum, who is Senior Director of Client and Media Services at Centro, where he leads day-to-day strategic client management and oversees the Midwest-based teams of those digital rock stars. So he's been at Centro for the last 8 years, but he's got a decade and a half of experience in digital media, many of which were focused on CPG brands, including Unilever, Kellogg's, and American Licorice. So let's load up those carts with all those packaged goodies, and I'm going to hand it off to April. April, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Ryan, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. As Ryan mentioned, over the past few weeks in our webinar series, we've been talking about industries that are in flux and how they are addressing some of the challenges and making changes to their business in response to those challenges. So specifically today, what we're going to share with you is starting off by just a little bit of what's happening in the CPG industry, specifically around COVID-19 and some of the high-level trends. Then we're going to shift and talk a little bit about what's going on within consumer behavior and some of the mindsets. And from there, I'm going to actually turn it over to Jared, and he's going to spend some time talking to you about advertising opportunities, potentially digital media, and how that can play a really important role in your overall marketing and media mix, in the importance of the message and the strategy. And then, as Ryan mentioned, we always like to leave time at the end of this to take a few questions. So with that, let's go ahead and just jump right in and start talking about what we're seeing in consumer packaged goods in response to COVID-19 and some of the high-level trends. So I thought it was really important to start today by just talking about the very significant increase in sales that the CPG industry has realized over a relatively short period of time. So this is research from Nielsen that just, punctuates, I think, what's happening within this particular sector of over a 2-week period ending March 21st, which, as most people recall, that's right around the time when we officially declared we were in a pandemic. A lot of businesses were closing, stay-at-home orders were being put into place, but the CPG industry realized an $8.5 billion increase in sales in that 2-week period. And just to put that into context, that is a 15-time average rate of change for a typical period. So certainly all industries are being impacted, some in different ways than others, but from a CPG standpoint, it's pretty notable in terms of the increase in sales. So if we take a look at what really sits behind that and what's driving that in terms of some of the specific areas of CPG, the first is just consumers, the mindset that they've been in, and the behaviors that they've been demonstrating in terms of really panic buying and stocking up on essentials. I think we've probably all in some way experienced going into, grocery stores or even placing online orders and maybe not being able to get exactly what we want or having some challenges with that. And that certainly has had an impact on this industry. With that, we have seen a substantial increase in just online orders, particularly as, states have put into place and local governments around staying at home over the past few weeks. We've seen a significant increase in people ordering, and particularly in two areas, non-perishable foods and household goods. And I think this does speak to the consumer mindset of not really knowing, especially early on in the days of COVID-19 and the pandemic, how long this was going to last, and taking the necessary precautions and preparations for at home. And that really lends itself to the increase in non-perishable food items. An increase in in-home meal preparation and consumption. We addressed this a few weeks ago in our QSR webinar, and it's certainly been an interesting time to see how CPG has benefited from consumers really leaning in, and as they've been kind of nesting and making more of their meals in home, really the benefit of that. And then I thought it was quite interesting to see this stat where 50% increase in categories such as cookies and salty snacks in particular. I think as everyone has kind of started settling in, adjusting, and really more importantly, kind of thinking about what's coming next as certain states are starting to reopen. We're talking about ways to kind of get the economy going again and starting to get back to business. But people have really leaned into comfort brands and comfort food as they've kind of found ways to deal with this. And again, I think that does speak to the consumer mindset. And then finally, a pretty big reversal in a trend that we've seen over the past few years. There's been a lot of emphasis on, more natural, organic, or potentially non-toxic products. That tends to be top of mind for a lot of consumers in terms of what they're bringing into their home and using from cleaning products. And because of the virus, we've actually started to see a reverse in that trend where, people are going back to maybe some of those brands of a long time that we're all very familiar with, and, really making sure that they've got the type of products that they want in their home from a cleaning, sanitizing purpose. And so it's going to be interesting to see because, until we really get to a place of a vaccine, will this be a long-term trend, and will it change how people view organic and non-toxic products? Because certainly as people and businesses open, we're still going to have a need for all of those cleaning and precautionary measures that we have in place. But moving on, wanted to talk a little bit about some of the subcategories and what we're seeing in terms of growth in sales. So specifically within the beverage industry, about a 10% increase in overall sales. Alcohol sales have certainly been part of this and have certainly increased over the past several weeks. Specifically within the home care products, a 40% increase. And what's really interesting is when you kind of look even underneath this around beauty products, there's been quite a bit of increase, and we're seeing a shift from historically what people might have been buying in mass stores or big box stores into more grocery, whereas they're trying to make fewer visits potentially to in-store or consolidating and their basket sizes increasing with their online orders. We've seen quite a bit of an increase here, and then a really large statistic of over 200% increase in sales growth for fresh meat alternatives. So certainly there are a lot of different brands out there that are plant-based alternatives, and as we've seen some strain on manufacturers, some of the meat plants and things of that nature, it's really lending itself to consumers trying new and different alternatives. And again, I think it's too early to know what the long-term impacts of that will be, but it's certainly something to keep an eye on within the CPG industry. If you go to the next slide, Ryan, I wanted to share, just as we kind of punctuate the impact of the coronavirus impact of most in-demand items. So this is some research from IRI that talks about, since late February, what is the average in-stock percentage for some key household items and key categories within CPG? Not at all surprising. Toilet paper, hand sanitizer, and then dried beans, which really speaks to the non-perishable food items. Those are the top three categories that have been, most in demand and have often showed up with empty shelves or limited supply in grocery. And that's really lent itself to consumers maybe trying private labels, brand switching, which we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And, certainly as we kind of start to enter this next phase I do think we're going to see a period of time where things like hand sanitizer, liquid soap, household cleaners, things of that nature are going to continue to be in high demand. And so it's going to be interesting to see how brands pivot and continue to try to ensure that there's supply to meet the consumer demand, because we know that these are still going to be very important household items and high demand for purchase. If we want to transition a little bit, I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about some of the consumer behaviors before we shift and talk specifically about advertising opportunities. And I think one of the largest behaviors and changes that we've seen in a relatively short period of time is just the growth in online sales, specifically within the CPG category. This is very recent data, just as of a couple of weeks ago, and it's really demonstrating the year-over-year increase in sales for the week ending April 18th. And as you can see across all of these various segments within the CPG category, there's pretty strong growth here, with food almost 70%, over 20% for both baby care and pet care. Health and beauty, pretty significant, of almost 50% growth in sales coming through online channels. As hair salons, nail salons are closed, people are doing things, in home and really leaning in, and a lot of those purchases are happening from an online standpoint. And then finally, almost 60% in terms of household care. And then finally, just to talk a little bit more about consumer behavior, we are starting to see what's being termed recession-like behaviors, which we've seen in the past, in past recessions, where consumers are doing a lot of brand switching from mainstream to more value-based brands. 54% of consumers have actually said that they've tried another brand over the past few months, and that's largely due to maybe their typical brand not being available. With that, this is where there's a pretty substantial increase in trial of private label, where 59% of consumers actually cited choosing a brand, a store brand or a private label brand in the past few months that maybe they previously hadn't tried. And I think that again speaks to some of the supply and demand issues that we've seen, in the market. But if, as a marketer within CPG, it's certainly an important point to keep in mind in really thinking about your overall strategy of there's kind of two sides to this. On one, you may be, having the opportunity to get trial among new or lapsed customers. And then for those that maybe have been historically brand loyal, but have switched and tried a private brand or a more value-based brand due to the current circumstances, how do you re-engage them with messaging that's relevant to try to retain their loyalty? And then finally, we're seeing that cost is definitely being placed as more of a value or a priority over convenience. And so these are all some of the consumer behaviors that are taking shape. And, it's going to be interesting to see over the coming weeks and months if this remains, a consumer behavior that really sticks, or if we start to see, as things eventually return back to a state of more normal, how we see these change. But with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jared now, because these are all things that really inform the advertising opportunities where digital can play a really important role in the importance of the message and the strategy. So Jared, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, April. So if we go to the next slide here, with the pandemic that's really changing the way the world consumes media and content, we felt it was important to show what's currently working for many of our clients in the CPG space. So here are three kind of quick snackable areas of opportunity that I'm going to dive into a little bit deeper. Number one being data. As we know, data always matters, but now data matters even more because consumer habits are changing in real time. So it's important we follow them as best we can. Number two, modifying your media mix. Sadly, the Olympics have been canceled. Coachella's been postponed. I guess the Olympics are postponed also. There's really no live sports. There's no big events, but people are still consuming content at home. So it's a lot of local news, even more Ozark, Last Dance, and of course, Carole Baskin and Tiger King. But what this presents is a huge opportunity, particularly in digital, as digital is a medium that allows for flexibility, quick optimizations, especially during an evolving pandemic. So I'm going to dive into three digital channels that we're seeing an explosion in demand with, and then finally getting creative. So this applies both from a messaging and a strategy standpoint. We're now several weeks into this damn thing, so most advertisers and agencies at this point have drastically shifted their creative, striking a more thoughtful tone. But now, what does it look like coming out on the other side? When can we start shifting back to brand-focused messaging and dare I say, product-specific verbiage. So that's kind of the setup, and now we'll dive in a little bit. So first here is following your evolving customer. So, you have first-party data and you have third-party data. And from a first-party perspective, we see advertisers really leaning into site analytics. This can come from a simple Google Analytics pixel that tracks site behavior, or something more advanced like a relationship with a data management platform. At Centro, we partner with Salesforce, DMP. We place pixels on behalf of our clients. And the thought here is there may be immediate opportunity for insights as to how consumers are changing their behaviors. For example, with one of our clients, we identified that consumers were spending a lot more time, actually an unprecedented amount of time, reading articles, researching POVs, and digesting white papers. So we use this type of insight to shift our targeting, our messaging, and our landing page strategy. From a third-party perspective, we're tapping into third-party data providers just like we always do. The goal being to find shoppers, whether they're staying at home and shopping on Instacart or they're going into an actual Kroger. Something to tie in here from earlier that April was talking about is there's a real opportunity, I think, for David, the challenger brand, to go after the Goliaths in their category. People are switching loyalties like we've really never seen before, and we think it's likely due to necessity and also some frustration that their brands of choice are not accessible. So, all you challenger brands out there, become the Goliath. I think now is the time to tap into third-party data like Visa and MasterCard. You can access that data through Basis and really go after some of those bigger brands with the information that's available. And one final point to make about programmatic in general is we're seeing some slight price efficiencies taking place. And this is likely due to a drastic drop in spend from travel and tourism and some retail clients. So it really does create an opportunity for CPG clients to capitalize on these price efficiencies that are testing some of the above data strategies. So on the next slide, we want to talk about 3 channels that we're seeing huge growth in. So first, as mentioned before, with people at home, live events essentially halted. We're seeing a drastic increase in time-shifted television, which AKA connected television. Minutes spent on connected TV are up 2x in March 2020 versus March 2019. Ad Exchanger conducted a recent survey that found 4 in 5 advertisers are likely to increase their CTV spend. So it's reasonable to believe that these dollars are coming from linear traditional television. We see opportunities on platforms like Hulu, Tubi, and across exchanges like SpotX and Telaria. The goal being to tap into pre-recorded shows, especially the Tiger Kings of the world. So second, nobody's listening to terrestrial radio right now because nobody's driving. So clients are repurposing those dollars into streaming audio. A recent Pandora study found there's a huge increase in co-listening to music with streaming audio. It also found that 50% of surveyed listeners want to see ads that are positive and uplifting, and 26% said that listening to music makes them feel safe during this time. So just a really smart channel, good place for positive, uplifting, family-style, creative messaging. Finally, in a time of crisis, audiences rely heavily on local news. Cable and local news viewing is up 25%. I know in Chicago, I see Tom Skilling and Andy Avalos way more than I would like. Both weather people. I always think it's kind of interesting that everyone knows their local weather person. I was born in Kansas City, and so I threw up the local KMBC TV KC logo and still remember my favorite weather person, Brian Buzzy. But I digress. Anyways, at Centro, local is our legacy business. So, what we can do is we can create custom whitelists, activating against local television, radio, and newspaper digital sites. And this is really important. And I think it actually segues nicely into this last slide that I have here about getting creative. So, coming out of this thing and as the country slowly starts to normalize, the most obvious reality is that there's really no uniformity in how we'll be easing up these stay-at-home orders. I believe Georgia and Texas are opening some shuttered parts of life back up today. I know Governor Pritzker in Illinois says we're at home till May 30th. There's just a ton of complexity here. My parents in Kansas City, They told me that stay-at-home orders in Kansas and Missouri are supposed to end on Monday, and that's at the state level, but at the city level, Kansas City is extended till May 15th. The point being that advertisers need to do their homework and really understand that messaging may need to be differentiated locally. Not every local community is going to be acting the same, and of course, this is far easier for regional advertisers and harder for national brands. At Centro, we're tapping into partners like Ninth Decimal and Cubic through our DSP, and they're providing us with real-time data on in-store visitation. So we're trying to inform our advertisers about when it makes sense to start speaking to driving in-store visitation versus direct-to-consumer buying or e-commerce. And finally, from a strategy perspective, we see, as I mentioned before, an unprecedented amount of time spent with ad units. There's a real opportunity to tap into higher impact units that promote engagement. We've seen an increase in carousels, page grabbers, Kanto box, and advertisements that drive to articles and point of views. So really take advantage of the extra time that people have on their hands to engage with your product. And finally here, messaging. At this point, brands have figured out the human element. Brand purpose leaders like Procter & Gamble and Unilever have run donation-driven efforts and viral social media activations trying to combat the coronavirus and really offset its financial impact. I know Unilever's Dove recently shifted its long-running Real Beauty program to highlight healthcare workers on the front lines of the pandemic and marks that masks have left on them. So we see brands repurposing. We know it's really hard to get out and film video right now, or high quality videos. So we see a lot of brands producing low budget content, maybe with stock footage and just some overlays with voice overlays, or even text on the screen. And it's effective in driving a thoughtful and human message and really resonating with viewers. So these are the 3 points that I wanted to hone in on in terms of data and really focusing on your media mix and thinking about how that should shift to take advantage of digital channels that are seeing unprecedented growth. And finally, getting creative with both your messaging and also your strategy and how you're getting back to normalcy and really thinking about a local approach to doing that. So that wraps up our presentation, and I can turn it over to Ryan to facilitate any questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jared. Thanks, April, for those great insights and those recommendations. Like Jared said, we're going to move in now to our Q&A time, as we've got about 7 minutes to see what we can get through. It looks like a few of you all have already found the question tab in the webinar app. Should be on the right-hand side. Feel free to plug in any questions that you've got, and we'll see what we can do to get through them and kind of talk through. So the first, let's see, we've got quite a few to look at. Well, this one just popped in from Alex. When do you think, this is for you, Jared, I guess April, you could jump in as well. When do you think consumers will be over the "here for you" messaging that you referenced on the last slide? That kind of fatigue of the piano music and all that good stuff. Jared, any thoughts? And then maybe we'll go to April.
Yeah, I mean, I think consumers are over it. I think brands are just being a little bit cautious and hesitant. And so, I think it's important that it's still better than the alternative in most locations. But I think what we're starting to advise our advertisers on is thinking about this local strategy and where can we start shifting back to that product-focused messaging, where people are starting to normalize and going into stores and getting out and moving around. So I think it's just balancing the what's appropriate at the local level.
Great. That's great. April, any additional comments there about that kind of shift in messaging?
I would just say I agree. I do think there is fatigue starting to take shape around those kind of messages. And I think Jared has, highlighted a few really strong points. And that's where I do think, digital can be such a strong channel to leverage very timely, relevant messages. And I think for each brand, it's really understanding, your consumer sales and what's happening within individual markets to that local play, and making sure that the message is relevant for what's happening in that particular market at that time. But I do think brands need to start thinking about shifting to more of the product-focused messaging. I think, consumers are probably to a place where they're ready to start kind of hearing some differentiated messaging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that there's so many best practices that we've learned through things like hyperlocal messaging or leveraging some of the different data sources that are out there and available to be able to target, whether that informs the media side or also informs the creative side of the messaging, that a lot of these practices that we've used for years can be applied as well. One question kind of related to the data that's from Josh. What about brands collecting more of their own first-party data through registration, loyalty, or CRM? Wouldn't that be the best route for relevant targeting? And I imagine best or better versus some of the third-party. Jared, do you want to provide some insight there of kind of that first-party data versus third-party?
Yeah, I mean, we always think that a client's data, the client's registration data, is going to be the best source of initial data, and it's going to have the highest match rate when we're plugging that in and trying to find those people out in the wild west of the internet. The one thing I'll say though is what I was trying to reference during the presentation is you get this registration data and that shows interest, but I think consumers are behaving slightly differently, maybe on O&O websites where they might be reading more articles than they ever were before instead of looking at the product pages. They just have more time for education. They have more time to just engage. So that's sort of what we're trying to get with like a DMP pixel that's placed on the website, is to try to understand that consumer behavior about what they're doing while they're on your website. But yeah, at the end of the day, we'll start with your registration data, and then we would move to potentially DMP, and then supplement with third-party data opportunities after that.
Great, that's great. April, here's one for you from Benjamin. Any insight into pricing shifts of products given the look to private label? Are CPG companies shifting their value propositions and/or modifying formats to provide more value for the dollar? You talked a little bit about kind of the shift to some of the private labels. Jared talked a little bit about some of the challenger brands. Are you seeing any of the bigger CPG companies even kind of get on the defensive?
It's a good question, and I definitely think with the shift to, or trial, I guess is a better way to put it, because I don't know if we know if the shift is permanent or long term to some private labels or more value-based brands. I do think it's an important consideration. I have not come across hard data that would say brands have definitely, on a mass level, started to take that approach. I think that's very specific to each individual brand, but I do think it's something important to watch as a CPG marketer. And I think it really depends on what's happening in terms of supply within a specific brand and what their competitive set is from the private label or value-based competitive set. But I think in terms of like messaging and thinking about that, I think it's really top of mind for consumers, where their discretionary dollars are going, and especially because there are a large number of people across the country that, are being financially impacted in a negative way because of the current circumstances. So I would expect that brands are going to start thinking about that and starting to make those kind of shifts. But I think we would need to get a little bit tighter data in order to very specifically address that question, which we're more than happy to do and follow up.
Love it. I love it. Here's one that I feel like is kind of the million, if not the billion-dollar question. It's from Riz. How can we convince a client that hasn't seen their sales rise or continue during the crisis that it's better to have a strategy that for them to remain relevant? Because it sounds like he's seeing some challenges where he's got some clients that have just completely stopped their efforts. Any suggestions there of kind of how to approach that? Yeah, Jared?
Yeah, I saw a stat recently that said, I think it was 84 or 86% of consumers expect their most trusted brands to continue advertising, despite any, it's not necessarily a pandemic, but whatever's going on. And I think it's just that kind of continued, being there, that awareness, that comforting messaging is important. If you see your brand go away for a certain subset of time, you're worried that, they might be severely impacted by this. And the truth is they might be, but at the end of the day, you don't want, as challenger brands are popping up left and right and people are switching loyalty, you want to continue to ensure that you're there for them, even if your sales are not up.
And Ryan, I will just add to that, and we can provide this research. There is research out there that states typically brands that during recessionary times, and not that one is always 100% applicable to the other, because recessions of past are not always the same, but typically in downturns of economic times, I guess is a better way to generalize it, brands that continue advertising typically come out ahead. And there's a lot of different research and stats that say, maintaining some presence is typically far better than going completely dark. So for the individual that asked that question, we can try to follow up and make some more information available. But if you do some research out there, there's definitely different studies that support that.
I love it. It's great. And I feel like that's a good one to wrap up. We were not able to get to all the questions, but we tried to pack in as much as we could over the last 30 minutes. Thank you, Jared. Thank you so much, April, for sharing your insights, sharing all this great research, these recommendations. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today and the fantastic questions. We appreciate you. When you log out, you will receive a survey. And if you could provide us some feedback on your experience, some suggestions for other things that you'd like to see, we always welcome that. And as I mentioned, the slides presented, as well as a recording of this webinar, will be sent to you via email. And next week actually brings us to the end of our webinar mini-series, as we're going to look at the state of education and e-learning. So come ready to learn about learning. With that, stay healthy, stay positive, and stay home. Maintain the 6 feet distance and keep those masks on. This concludes our presentation for today. I'm Ryan Manchi. This has been a special webinar mini-series brought to you by the Central Institute. I'm so glad that you joined us. Have a great day.